Welcome to Nocturnal Tales. Tonight, we return to London with Captain Hastings for an adventure that begins as harmless male celebration and turns, with alarming speed, into a vanished man, a ticking clock, and the particular kind of trouble that flourishes in hotel lobbies, back passages, and late-night messages that cannot wait until morning. The Bridegroom Who Mislaid Himself opens on the eve of a wedding, one of those civilized occasions where everyone is dressed for decency. But the city has other plans. As always, this tale is inspired by the spirit of Agatha Christie and the great Golden Age crime writers, but the plot, characters, and text you're about to hear are entirely our own creation. We've borrowed that classic world of clubs, taxis, discreet corridors, and well-bred families, and asked what happens when a bridegroom disappears with only hours to spare, and the one man who might help is the one who remembers the least. This episode is brought to you thanks to the listeners who support Nocturnal Tales on Patreon and those who help us with one-off donations on Buy Me a Coffee or PayPal. If you'd like to support our work, you'll find the links in the description. Now, settle in, because the night is wet, the champagne has been careless, and somewhere in London, a wedding day is already beginning to go wrong. Chapter 1. The Stag Night. There are certain invitations which a man accepts first and examines afterward. They appeal not to judgment, but to vanity, appetite, and that rash conviction which overtakes even the soberest of us when we are told that our presence will improve the company. Such an invitation reached me on a damp Thursday afternoon in March. I was alone in the flat at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot having gone out on some errand connected, as I understood it, with a lady, a pearl necklace, and a retired Belgian magistrate who had developed a most inconvenient conscience. When Poirot is engaged upon such matters, it is useless to ask questions. One receives only a lifted forefinger and a remark to the effect that all will become clear to the meanest intelligence in due course. I had therefore resigned myself to a quiet evening with the paper and a chop, when George brought in a note upon a salver. It was from Charles Chudley. Now the reader may perhaps remember the Chudleys, Lady Eleanor, her son Charles, and that excellent little spaniel Pip, who had once before played a modest but honourable part in an affair into which, to my temporary distinction, I had been drawn without Poirot's assistance. Since then I had seen them once or twice in town. Charles, who had profited a good deal from his earlier follies, appeared steadier than of old, and Lady Eleanor had taken to treating me with a degree of maternal approval, which, though flattering, always filled me with an obscure sense that I ought to have brushed my hair more carefully. The note ran as follows: My dear Hastings, if you are in town and tolerably alive, you must join us this evening. A small stag dinner before I go to the altar, and am handed over, decorated and helpless, to the mercies of matrimony. A few old friends, a little noise, and probably some advice no sane man would follow. We dine at 7:30 at the Bellarmine Club. Come and save me from the worst of my companions. Yours ever, Charles. Below this, in a hand less firm and rather more alarming, some fellow had added, Bring stamina. I smiled. There was something agreeable in the notion. Charles was to be married on the morrow to Miss Cynthia Vale, the daughter of a prosperous family with legal connections and, if rumour spoke true, a very formidable aunt. I had met the young lady once only. She was lively, pretty, and of that modern order of woman who appear to know exactly what they want, whilst still allowing a man the illusion that he is leading the conversation. It had struck me then that Charles was fortunate. I glanced at the clock, considered my chop, despised it, and rang for George. Lay out my dark dinner suit, I said. The one that does not make me look like an undertaker. George, who has long since accepted that he is serving a man of imperfect exactitude, merely inclined his head. Yes, sir. He paused. Shall I also lay out the black waistcoat, sir? The one in which you have more confidence?" I looked at him suspiciously, but there was nothing to be done. George has the unnerving gift of speaking the truth in a tone that suggests he is merely discussing linen. "You may," I said with dignity. I was dressing when Poirot returned. He entered my room without knocking, as is his habit when he believes a human being may at any moment commit some aesthetic outrage that could yet be prevented. He stood upon the threshold, immaculate as ever, his patent shoes gleaming and his moustaches lifted at the ends in an expression of refined distrust. "Tiens," he said, "you go out." "I do." "Where?" "To a stag dinner." Poirot shut his eyes for a brief instant, like a priest hearing that a promising choir boy has joined the cavalry. "For whom?" "Charles Chudley." "Ah." He tapped one finger against his lip. "The young man who was once suspected of theft and had the weakness for horses, debts, and poor judgment?" "The same, though I think we may admit he has improved." A little improvement in a man is like a little less water in the English soup. One is grateful, but one does not become enthusiastic. "You are in a cheerful mood." "I am practical. These gatherings of men before marriage, what are they? They eat too much, they drink too much, they tell stupid stories, and in the end one of them puts on a hat belonging to the hall porter. You have never been to one." "Exactly. I preserve my innocence." I laughed and reached for my tie. "You may sneer, old man, but it is only a dinner." Poirot's eyes rested on me thoughtfully. "Hastings, when an Englishman says of an evening that it is only a dinner, I am always certain that before midnight there will be confusion, broken glass, and somebody saying, 'I say, let us go on somewhere.' That is a gross caricature." "Yes," said Poirot, "but not gross enough." He came in then, and with the quiet ruthlessness of a master correcting a schoolboy, retied my tie for me. "You will return at what hour?" "Oh, a reasonable one." He gave a soft exclamation of contempt. "Mon ami, the hour at which you call something reasonable and the hour at which it actually occurs have never once in your life been acquainted." He stepped back, surveyed me, and nodded. "At least you do not look too foolish. That is something. Remember one thing." "What?" "If there is a quarrel, a lady, a wager, or an automobile suggested after 11 o'clock, do not involve yourself." "My dear Poirot." "No. Listen to me. In England men say, 'What can it hurt?' 5 words more dangerous than any revolver." He paused at the dressing table, and his eye fell upon the note from Charles, which I had left lying open. He picked it up, read, and set it down again with deliberate care. "This Chudley, the same as in your small business at the country house last year?" "The same." "Then there is a dog, a small brown spaniel, you called him. Pip." "Yes." "You mentioned him 3 times in your account of that affair. Once is ordinary, 3 times is an attachment." He regarded me with that indulgent severity he reserves for English sentimentality. "Hastings, if a dog presents himself to you in difficulty tonight, you will leave it to its owner. You hear me? There is no reason to imagine a dog will. There is every reason. You are predisposed, you are tired, and you are going to a stag dinner. 3 conditions out of which the English invariably produce small animals in distress." I laughed. "You are fanciful." "I am economical. I am making in advance the speech I should otherwise have to make in the morning." With that excessively irritating remark, he took himself off to the drawing-room, leaving me to wonder whether he was joking, deducing, or merely being Belgian. The Bellarmine Club stood in one of those quiet streets off St. James's, where discretion, good wine, and elderly portraits seemed to enter a conspiracy against vulgarity. The porter knew Charles and directed me upstairs to a private room, from which there already issued a quantity of laughter sufficient to suggest that the evening had begun before punctual men had arrived. I entered to find a cheerful disorder in progress. Charles Chudley came at once to greet me, his face flushed, his hair a trifle more disordered than was his custom, and his expression that of a man determined to enjoy himself, while some quieter part of his mind stood at the back wringing its hands. "Hastings, splendid. You've come to lend tone to the proceedings. I understood I was to save you from your companions. Too late for that. They have had champagne." He drew me in. There were 6 men present, among them Major Roland Pritchard, as hearty and copper-faced as ever, and a young barrister named Vale, the bride's brother, whose easy assurance and polished insolence marked him at once as the sort of fellow who had never been denied anything except, perhaps, the truth. The rest were assorted cousins and club friends, whose names I could not have been expected to remember after the second course. The table was admirable. Oysters, cold salmon, a saddle of lamb, potatoes with more butter than conscience, and champagne that arrived and vanished with almost military efficiency. Somebody had arranged small cards at the places with mock titles. Mine read, "Captain Hastings, Military Advisor and Moral Support." I took my seat to general applause, which I found excessive, but not unpleasant. The first part of the evening went off with perfect good humour. Charles was toasted, congratulated, advised, warned, and generally treated as a condemned man whose execution had been postponed on the understanding that he behaved sportingly until the morning. Pritchard thumped the table and declared marriage the making of some men and the finishing of others. Young Vale said the trick was never to let one's wife discover one's actual character. "And what is your actual character?" I asked. He considered. "Adaptable." "Meaning slippery," said Charles. "Meaning civilized," returned Vale. We all laughed. Yet more than once, as the talk swelled and rolled, I observed Charles glance at the clock. It was not the glance of a man bored or eager for bed. It had something tighter in it, a watchfulness, almost an anxiety. Twice I caught him absent-mindedly feeling in his breast pocket, as though to reassure himself that some paper or letter remained there. I put it down, naturally enough, to wedding nerves. A fellow may dine gaily, and still feel an inward chill at the notion that by tomorrow afternoon every aunt in both families will be entitled to look at him with affectionate judgment. I observed, too, though less clearly then than afterward, that young Vale himself was watching his future brother-in-law in a manner not wholly fraternal. Twice he opened his mouth to say something to Charles in a lower tone, then appeared to think better of it and laughed with the others instead. A man who is about to be well served by his sister's marriage should not, in my opinion, look so preoccupied over his third glass. At about 9:30 the cloth was drawn, cigars appeared, and with them that fatal phase of male festivity at which every man grows a little more sincere than is good for him. Stories of school, regiment, old affairs, and things that had damn nearly happened began to circulate. Charles drank, but not heavily. I noticed that. Others took up the labour for him. Pritchard, who had shifted from champagne to brandy with the grim confidence of a veteran campaigner, told a story involving a subaltern, a colonel's wife, and a dog-cart which I still maintain must have improved in the telling. As for me, I was in excellent spirits. There are evenings when one feels equal to anything. Witty, well-dressed, socially secure, and in harmony with the universe. I had reached precisely that stage at which a man begins to believe his own best qualities are only now becoming properly visible to others. It was, I admit, the brandy. Around 10, Charles came to my elbow. "Hastings, old man, would you mind awfully if we stretched the thing a little? There are 1 or 2 fellows downstairs who insist we must end elsewhere or be thought dead." "Elsewhere?" He gave a faint, not entirely convincing grin. "A little supper place in Piccadilly, nothing dreadful." I heard, as though from a great distance, Poirot's voice. If there is a quarrel, a lady, a wager, or an automobile suggested after 11 o'clock, do not involve yourself." "Naturally," I said. "My dear fellow, I am entirely at your disposal." We went out in a laughing procession, collected coats, hats, and canes in no very orderly fashion, and passed into the London night. There had been rain earlier, and the streets shone. Motor lamps cast long, pale ribbons upon the wet pavement. Taxis slid up and away. Women in wraps and satin shoes disappeared through revolving doors. And all London seemed at that hour to possess some secret engagement of its own. It was while we were arranging ourselves, with absurd seriousness, into 2 taxis that the first of the evening's true confusions occurred. A small, agitated barking arose from somewhere near the curb. A little golden-brown shape shot between a pair of legs, darted under a hansom cab, emerged, and launched itself at me with the unmistakable air of one who has discovered at last the only reliable person in England. It was Pip. "Good Lord!" I exclaimed, stooping. "Pip!" The little dog wriggled madly, pawed at my waistcoat, and gave short, frantic cries of excitement and relief. At the same instant a feminine voice cried, "Captain Hastings!" I looked up. Miss Anne Foster stood on the pavement a few yards away, wrapped in a dark evening cloak, one gloved hand raised, her hat slightly askew as though she had come out in haste. Under the street lamp, I saw at once that she looked prettier than I had remembered, cool, fair, and self-possessed, though at present plainly annoyed. Behind her, under the awning of a hotel entrance, loomed Lady Eleanor, magnificent in satin and old lace, with the expression of a Roman empress whose campaign has unexpectedly involved a spaniel. "Miss Foster," I said, "what on earth—" "Pip slipped his lead," she said. "He saw someone he knew and dashed straight into the traffic. Lady Eleanor is convinced he prefers danger to comfort." "Quite understandable," I returned, still holding the dog. "Most spirited animals do." Miss Foster's eyes flickered, and I thought I saw the beginning of a smile. "We are coming from dinner with friends of Lady Eleanor's," she said. "And you, I suppose, are not." Her glance took in the taxis, the cluster of men, Pritchard's booming laughter, and Charles, who had at that moment turned sharply away to speak with a man standing half in shadow near the hotel steps. I followed her look. The man was middle-aged, well-dressed, and of a professional sort, perhaps a solicitor or man of business. He had a long, dry, clean-shaven face, a brushed hat, and the unpleasantly tidy appearance of a fellow who expects everyone else to become flurried first. I could not see him clearly at that distance, but I saw enough to know that the exchange between him and Charles was not social. Charles's easy expression had vanished. He stood tense, listening. The other man spoke rapidly and with insistence. Then Charles saw me watching and moved at once back toward us. "Everything all right?" I said. He smiled too quickly. "Perfectly. Only a fellow with a message, nothing at all." He bent to pat Pip, but the dog shrank oddly, and for one instant gave a low growl, not at Charles, I thought, but toward the retreating figure on the pavement. Lady Eleanor had by then joined us. "Captain Hastings," she said, "you appear to have become involved with my dog." "I assure you, Lady Eleanor, the responsibility is mutual." "Then I am relieved. Pip has always had questionable judgment in men, but he does occasionally improve." Charles laughed, though still a shade distractedly. "Mother, we are just going on." Lady Eleanor looked at him with that grave, affectionate scrutiny mothers reserve for sons on the brink of either marriage or idiocy. "Do not be absurdly late, Charles." "No, no." Anne Foster was taking Pip from me when some cry of "pile in" arose from our party, and the whole business became muddled. Somebody had entered the wrong taxi. Vale was insisting we had lost a hat. Pritchard declared that if anyone sang in his cab, he should leave them in the street. Pip, who had only just been recovered, wriggled again, twisted free for a second time, and landed squarely back in my arms. "I'll bring him in and settle him," I said gallantly. "No trouble at all." Anne hesitated. "You needn't. My dear Miss Foster, I am sober enough to manage a spaniel." She looked at me for one brief second in a way I did not then fully understand. "That," she said, "is a sentence I should like to hear repeated tomorrow." The next 20 minutes exist in my memory like a row of lamps seen through fog. I recall entering the hotel lobby with Pip under one arm and my hat in the other hand. I recall handing the dog to someone, whether a porter, a maid, or a bishop, I could not swear. I recall returning to the pavement and finding that our original taxis had vanished and been replaced by others. I recall Charles saying to me in a lower tone than before, "I've one thing to put right before morning." I remember replying with the profound sympathy of a man who has had brandy and imagines himself wise. "My dear fellow, that is marriage all over." I remember Anne passing us once more in the lobby beyond the glass doors, turning her head slightly as though to say something, then apparently deciding against it. And then the thread snaps. There is afterwards only a confusion of late supper, laughter, a piano somewhere, the sensation that someone was arguing in a corridor, and a distinct impression that I was behaving with uncommon charm. That last detail I set down, in fairness, as probably unreliable. The chapter of memory closes with a taxi, a wet street, and Pip licking my hand solemnly in the dark. How Pip came to be with me in that taxi, why he remained with me, and what became in those hours of Charles Chudley. Those were questions reserved for the morning. And the morning, as I was soon to discover, was to open less like the cheerful aftermath of a bachelor dinner than like the beginning of one of those impossible adventures into which, with the best intentions in the world, I have so often contrived to stumble. Chapter 2. The Morning After. I awoke with the profound conviction that I had been murdered. It is astonishing how complete an illusion this may be for the first 3 seconds. My head throbbed with the rhythmical malice of a blacksmith. My tongue appeared to have been upholstered in dust. One eye opened, then the other, each with reluctance, and as consciousness returned by degrees, I perceived that if I had not in fact been killed, I had at least been very thoroughly punished. I lay in my own bed at Whitehaven Mansions. This was in itself surprising, though not alarming. The alarming part was that my left boot stood on the mantelpiece, my waistcoat hung from the lampshade, and a silver-plated ashtray of unfamiliar pattern had somehow established itself upon the washstand, as if it had always lived there. More extraordinary still, a small warm weight pressed against my knee. I turned my head. Pip was asleep on my blanket. He lay on his side in the contented abandonment of a creature whose conscience is clear and whose arrangements have been excellent. One paw rested against my pyjamas. His ears lay like silk upon the sheet, and at my movement he opened one eye, wagged the tip of his tail once in a faint and forgiving manner, then shut it again. I sat upright so suddenly that the room revolved, and I was obliged to clutch the bedpost. "Good Lord," I said aloud. "Pip." At the sound of his name, the dog rose, stretched elaborately, and stepped onto my chest with the serene confidence of an animal who believes a man exists chiefly as an item of furniture. I pushed him gently aside and attempted to think. A mistake in my condition. I had a flashing memory of wet pavement, hotel light, Anne Foster's face under a dark hat, Charles saying something about putting one thing right before morning, and then nothing reliable. Nothing at all. A blank as flat and insolent as a closed door. I rang the bell. George entered almost at once. His expression was not, I regret to say, one of surprise. That a gentleman may wake to find a strange dog in his bedchamber did not seem, in George's view, to exceed the ordinary range of my capabilities. "Good morning, sir." "George, why is there a dog in my room?" You returned with him at 2:15, sir, in a taxi, carrying the animal, your coat, and what appeared to be 2 bouquets, though one had suffered. Was I alone? Apart from the dog, sir. You informed me, however, that he was a witness and not to be contradicted. I closed my eyes. Did I indeed? Yes, sir. You also requested a notebook in order that you might begin inquiries at once. But upon receiving it, you wrote only the word Pip, and then went to bed. He handed me the notebook. There, in my own hand, sprawling and uncertain, was indeed the single word, Pip. Under it I had made what I first took for a map, and then recognized as a rather poor attempt at a top hat. "This," I said, "is humiliating." "Yes, sir. Shall I bring coffee?" "Bring a gallon." He glanced at Pip. "And perhaps something for the dog?" That touched my pride. "A little. Not too much. I am not encouraging permanent residence." Pip, hearing himself discussed, jumped lightly from the bed and trotted toward George with that immediate transfer of allegiance in which dogs excel. When George had gone, I rose and began, with difficulty and many pauses, to inspect the wreckage of the previous night. My dinner jacket was mud-splashed at one cuff. My shirt studs were not my own. In the pocket of my coat I found a taxi receipt, a club matchbook, half of a paper hat, and a receipt for a ham sandwich purchased at 1:35 a.m., which I had no recollection whatever of eating. More disturbing was the absence of my watch. I patted every pocket twice. Gone. A gentleman may mislay many things after a late evening. He does not lightly mislay his watch. On the dressing-table lay a folded hotel envelope. I seized it eagerly, only to discover that it contained nothing save the printed heading and a faint ring of what I strongly suspected was champagne. There came then a knock at the door of the flat, followed by George's tread in the passage, a murmur, and after an instant, another knock, more urgent this time. Before I could answer, the door opened and Miss Anne Foster came in. She was dressed in a dark travelling coat and hat, and had plainly come in haste. Yet even in haste she looked remarkably composed. There are women who, when troubled, contrive only to become more distinct. Anne Foster was one of them. She halted on the threshold as George withdrew, and her eyes rested for the briefest instant on my appearance. Half-dressed, hair disordered, one collar button in, one out. "Good morning, Captain Hastings." "Miss Foster." I made a useless movement toward dignity. "I beg your pardon if I had known that you were entertaining a dog and a hangover. Perhaps I should have sent a card." There was no actual smile in it, but there was the beginning of one. I gestured helplessly. "I am ashamed to say I remember very little." "So I gathered." She removed her gloves slowly. "You brought Pip home." "Yes. I see that this is so. What I do not see is why. I hoped you might tell me." That sobered me more than any coffee. "Was he not restored to you?" "He was. Or rather, he was supposed to be. The night porter at the hotel states that you insisted on taking him because, as you put it, there are forces abroad." I groaned. "That sounds like me in a condition I should prefer not to revisit." Her tone altered then, became quieter. "Captain Hastings, Charles has disappeared." I stared at her. Disappeared? He did not come home. Not to Lady Eleanor's house, nor to the hotel, nor anywhere we have thought to ask. A sharp, unpleasant clarity cut through my headache. "When was he last seen?" "By you, it seems." I sat down rather hard. There are statements which, though perfectly simple, produce the effect of a blow. This was one of them. "By me?" "You were among the last with him after the dinner. Mr. Vale saw you speak together outside the hotel. After that, Charles left again. No one now appears certain with whom." I raked my memory and found only fragments. I remember the pavement, and some fellow speaking to him, a man of business type, and Charles said, yes, he said he had one thing to put right before morning. Anne's expression sharpened. You remember that? Yes, or part of it. That is more than anyone else has managed to extract from the rest of the party. Mr. Vale recalls only that his brother-in-law-elect appeared oddly earnest. Major Pritchard remembers denouncing the decline of port. The others are of no use at all. And Lady Eleanor? She has borne up splendidly, which means she has had almost no sleep and is conducting herself as though social collapse were a household inconvenience. The bride's family do not yet know the truth in full. They believe Charles has been delayed. I looked at the clock. What time is it? Nearly 11. The wedding is at 2. That gave the thing at once its true proportion. A missing man is serious. A missing bridegroom on his wedding day is a calamity surrounded by hats. And you came to me because... Because you were there. Because Pip is here. Because Charles trusted you. And because, although I am willing to be practical, I cannot tell Lady Eleanor that her son has run away unless I am certain of it. I rose. My dear Miss Foster, I would never suppose... No, she said. Most people already have. That checked me. There was no self-pity in her tone, only fatigue and resolve. He has debts, she went on. He has nerves. He has been under pressure. If he has done something foolish, I should like to know whether it was folly, fear, or something else. There is a difference. Yes, I said slowly. There is. Pip, who had been examining my second boot, came and sat squarely between us, looking from one to the other like a magistrate awaiting evidence. Anne glanced down at him. And he refuses to leave your side. That, I said, is because I saved him from traffic. Or because you stole him. I did not steal him. You did in effect carry him off in a taxi. I did so, I am certain, under the influence of duty. Or brandy. Miss Foster, you are severe. Only accurate. Had I not been feeling so wretched, I might have enjoyed it more openly. As it was, I could only observe again that she had one of those minds which go directly to the centre of things. It is a quality deeply attractive in a woman, though occasionally uncomfortable to a man. Very well, I said. We must reconstruct the evening. That is what I hoped you would say. I need coffee first. That too, she replied. George entered with a tray at that exact moment, as though he had been stationed outside listening for reason to prevail. The coffee was excellent, and I drank 2 cups with an eagerness bordering on vice. Pip received a saucer of water and a scrap of chicken, which he accepted as his due. As I revived, the practical side of matters began to emerge. I took up the notebook in which I had last night inscribed only the dog's name with criminal inadequacy. Let us set it out. Charles dined at the Bellarmine, then we went on somewhere else. The Marischal Rooms in Piccadilly, said Anne. A private supper club with musical ambitions. There was a piano. There is always a piano in such places. It is how men know they have gone too far. I wrote, Bellarmine, Marischal Rooms, Hotel, Unknown. Lady Eleanor and you were at the hotel? For dinner with friends, yes. We met Charles and the party by chance, or nearly by chance. Pip slipped loose. You intervened. Afterwards, Charles was approached by a man. The man, you saw him too? Only he had the look of someone accustomed to being admitted. A solicitor? Possibly. He spoke sharply? Not loudly, but with urgency. Charles seemed cornered, perhaps. That was well said. I wrote it down and underlined it. And then Charles said he had something to put right before morning. After which, you all went on. At some later point, Charles seems to have separated from the others. The taxi doorman at the Marischal Rooms remembers him leaving around midnight or a little after, but not whether he was alone. Mr. Vale insists he himself left later. Major Pritchard remembers nothing useful at all. Quite in character. No note? No message? No telephone call? Nothing. And the bride has been told Charles is detained on an urgent family matter. For another hour or two that may serve. After that, it will not. I stood up and began to pace, which always helps me to think, though Poirot maintains that in my case it chiefly helps me to wear the carpet. Very well. One cannot conclude flight without evidence, nor can one conclude abduction in the melodramatic sense. He may have gone to meet that man. He may have been drawn into some private difficulty. He may even now be trying to spare his mother some scandal. Anne looked at me quickly. That is the first sensible thing anyone has said this morning. I stopped. Anyone? Inspector Morton from the local station suggested at once that gentlemen often vanish before weddings and usually return once hungry. An ass. He is not imaginative, nor observant. Hunger has nothing to do with it. At this there came from the drawing-room a distinct and irritated cough. Poirot. I had forgotten for the moment that he was in the flat at all. Anne and I exchanged a glance, and I went out at once. Poirot was seated precisely in the middle of the sofa, one leg crossed over the other, a cup of chocolate in his hand. He wore a dove-grey dressing-gown of outrageous elegance, and held that cup as though he were conferring an honour upon cacao itself. He regarded me without surprise. So there is a dog. There is also a missing bridegroom. I heard. You had better bring in the lady. Anne had come to the doorway by then, and he rose to bow over her hand. Mademoiselle Foster. Monsieur Poirot. Her tone held relief, though restrained. You advise? I advise Captain Hastings to act and myself to remain here. Remain here? I said. Hastings, you wish always that I should rush to the scene, wave the arms, and say, "Ha!" But intelligence is not a terrier. It is not improved by running. If I come, everyone will at once wait for me to perform a miracle. They will tell me 10 foolish things, conceal the one useful one, and look offended if I ask who paid the taxi. Whereas you, he pointed his spoon at me, you were there. You are trusted. Also, because you are thought by many people to be less dangerous than you are, they will speak more freely. It is difficult to know whether to be pleased by this. Anne said quietly, Then what should he do? Poirot turned to her. Begin at the last voluntary act of the missing man, not the last foolish act which with Englishmen is often impossible to identify. Ask, what did he choose? Whom did he choose to meet? What did he fear before he vanished? Do not begin with romance unless you have evidence. Do not begin with money unless you have figures. And for heaven's sake, do not begin with the theory that all men are cowards before marriage. It is too easy. He set down his cup. And keep the little dog with you. Why? Because he knows something. That is absurd. Poirot spread out his hands. Then you may ignore me. He returned calmly to his chocolate. There are times when living with a genius is intolerable. I went back into my room in a heat of irritation, which nevertheless concealed the uncomfortable fact that he was, as usual, probably right. Anne was standing by the window, Pip at her feet. Well? Poirot refuses to come, but he offers oracles from the sofa. And were they useful? I paused, confoundedly. That too is like him, I suppose. I took up my coat. Very well. Charles's last voluntary act was to speak with that dark-coated fellow. After that he left the company and did not return. So we begin there. At the hotel, then the Marischal Rooms, Then anyone who saw him afterward. We trace him hour by hour. Anne picked up her gloves. I shall come. My dear Miss Foster, this may turn into a tiring business. I am not ornamental, Captain Hastings. No, I only meant. You meant to be chivalrous. It is a kind impulse, but not always a useful one. I drew myself up. Then perhaps you will allow me to be useful instead. At that, for the first time, she gave me a real smile. That would be an excellent beginning. We went out together a few minutes later, Pip trotting briskly between us on a lead George had somehow produced from nowhere. As we descended in the lift, I became aware, despite the urgency of the matter, of a curious lift in my spirits. The headache had retreated to a manageable campaign. The air of crisis sharpened the nerves. And there is no denying that to go into action beside a pretty woman who thinks you only intermittently sensible has an enlivening effect upon a man. Yet beneath this there remained a graver thought. Charles Chudley had vanished with only hours to spare before his wedding. Somewhere in London, among clubs and taxis and hotel corridors and the remains of the previous night's foolishness, lay the reason why. And unless we found it quickly, there would by afternoon be not merely a missing man, but a ruined ceremony, a humiliated family, and enough social wreckage to keep aunts talking until Christmas. Chapter 3. Pip becomes a detective. There are few things less flattering to a man than to revisit in daylight and sobriety the scenes in which he has recently been convivial. Piccadilly at noon possesses none of the charitable obscurity with which it cloaks one's errors after midnight. The pavements looked hard, the facades judgmental, and every taxi driver appeared to know by instinct which gentleman before him had last night behaved below his own standard. Miss Foster and I drove first to the hotel where Lady Eleanor had dined, and where Pip, by his conduct, had first introduced confusion into what ought to have been a straightforward evening. Pip himself sat between us in the taxi, with the grave attention of a dog who knows perfectly well that human beings have made a muddle and must now be managed. From time to time he placed one paw upon my knee, whether in encouragement or control I could not determine. "You seem very much at home with him," Anne observed. "He has excellent instincts." "So I begin to see." There was in her tone that faintly teasing note which had now become familiar enough to keep me in a state of useful alertness. The hotel porter remembered us at once. Or rather, he remembered Pip, which I found slightly offensive until I reflected that a man carrying off a spaniel from a hotel lobby at midnight is perhaps more distinctive than he ought to be. "Yes, sir," he said, with a respectful glance at Anne. The little dog got loose. There was a bit of confusion. Gentlemen in evening clothes took charge. "That was I said. "Yes, sir." He managed to make this sound like an interesting detail, but not a recommendation. "And Mr. Charles Chudley?" Anne asked. "Did you observe him after that?" "He spoke outside with a gentleman, miss." I recall that because the other party did not seem to belong to the festive lot. Dark overcoat, proper sort of gent, not clubby, more office-like. "Did you hear any of what was said?" "No, sir. Only the young gentleman said, 'It cannot wait till morning,' and the other answered, 'Morning will be too late.' Something of that kind." Anne and I exchanged a glance. There it was again. Urgency, pressure, something to be put right before morning. It was no romantic whim now. The phrase had bones on it. "Did the man give a name?" "No, miss, but he'd been asking after Mr. Chudley already. Came through the lobby 10 minutes before and inquired whether the party from the Bellarmine had been seen." I made a note. "And after speaking with him, did Mr. Chudley leave?" "He went off with his own party first, sir. Got into a taxi with the others, but whether the dark-coated gent followed later I couldn't say. It was something, but not enough." We crossed next to the Marischal Rooms. which by daylight looked less like a temple of cheerful dissipation and more like a place that had once entertained ideas above its station. A sleepy man in shirt-sleeves admitted us, and upon hearing our business, sent for the night manager, who proved to be thin, smooth, and discreet in the professional manner of one who has seen every type of behaviour and disapproves of all with equal moderation. "Yes, Captain Hastings, I remember your party. Mr. Chudley and party arrived shortly after 10:30 and occupied the Blue Salon. Supper, drinks, music. Several gentlemen sang, though not, if I may say so, effectively. That, I said, would not have been me." His expression did not alter. "No, sir." Anne coughed slightly, and I suspected her of suppressing amusement. "Did Mr. Chudley leave at any point?" she asked. "Yes, miss, just after midnight. He received a note, brought in by one of the hall boys, folded, no envelope. Mr. Chudley read it, swore softly, and asked for his coat." "Do you still have the note?" "No, sir. Mr. Chudley took it with him, but the hall boy may remember who handed it over." He sent for the boy, who proved to be a narrow youth with solemn hair and a face so honest that I instinctively distrusted his memory. Still, in this case it served. "Yes, sir, it was a lady. Veiled, outside entrance. She didn't come in proper, just gave me the folded note and said it was for Mr. Chudley urgent." Anne straightened at once. "A lady?" "Yes, miss. Dark cloak, small hat, gloves, nice voice." "Anything else?" The boy frowned heroically. "She smelled nice." "Good God," I muttered. Anne, however, remained calm. "Did Mr. Chudley appear to know who it was from before he opened it?" "I couldn't say, miss, but after he read it, he looked queer. Like when a gentleman's trying not to look queer." That, though maddening, was not wholly without value. "And he left alone?" "Yes, miss, in a hurry." He did not return. There was a little silence. I confess my mind at once leapt where any decent melodrama would have wished it to leap. A veiled lady, a clandestine note, a bridegroom vanishing before the wedding. Anne turned to me as we stepped back toward the pavement. "Well?" "Well," I said cautiously, though within I was anything but cautious. "One cannot ignore the obvious possibility that Charles may have gone to meet a woman." Anne's expression chilled by a degree. How quick men are to be flattered by the least scrap of feminine mystery. "My dear Miss Foster, this is not flattery. It is inference. It is laziness. A note comes. It is delivered by a woman. Immediately every man decides the matter must be romantic. It spares him the effort of asking what else a woman may carry besides temptation." I opened my mouth, shut it, and then, because fairness compelled me, said, "You may have a point." "I generally do." We walked on. The next task was to recover, if possible, the sequence of our own muddled movements after Charles had left. This proved less dignified. At the desk I had paid no bill. At the cloakroom I had left no hat. At the bar I had, apparently, attempted to pay for someone else's whiskey with a theatre programme dating from February. None of this brought us nearer Charles. Then, just as I had begun to feel the investigation slipping into the sort of absurdity from which no man emerges with distinction, Pip stopped. He had been trotting briskly on the lead, nose low, ears flicking. Now he gave a small sharp bark and pulled, not toward the taxi rank or the club, but toward the side passage that ran beside the building toward a mews behind. "Hello," I said. "He has picked up something," Anne said quickly. Pip pulled harder. We followed. The passage smelled of damp brick, stale cigar smoke, and kitchen refuse. Yet the dog moved with sudden determination, nose to the ground, then to the air, then ground again, until he came to a service door standing ajar at the rear of the building. There he began to scratch furiously. A kitchen maid opened it with the expression of one prepared to repel callers of every description. The sight of Anne softened her a little, and the sight of me, I think, confirmed her suspicion that trouble had returned. Yes, I showed my card. We are trying to trace a gentleman who left the Marischal Rooms last night. Mr. Charles Chudley. This dog appears to think he came this way. The maid looked at Pip, then at us. The little dog was here last night. You are sure? Yes, sir. Came rushing round the back after midnight. There was a bit of a scuffle down the alley out of sight of the lamp. 2 or 3 gentlemen very merry, and another sort not so merry, a quieter gentleman, dark coat, giving orders. I didn't get a clear look. It was over in a moment. Afterwards one of the swell party came tearing round after the dog. Not Mr. Chudley, a fair gentleman, bit the worse for wear. I felt an inward sinking. Did he happen, I said, with as much dignity as I could preserve, to resemble me? The maid brightened. Oh, yes, sir, it was you. Anne turned her face away for a second. I see, I said faintly. Yes, sir. You came tearing round saying, he's a witness, confound it, and the dog had got hold of somebody's glove. You asked if there was a back way to the hotel. Now that was something. A glove? Said Anne at once. Whose glove? The maid shrugged. No idea, miss. A lady's, I think. Pale colour. The gentleman... Here she glanced at me with interest. The gentleman took it off him in the end and put it away in his pocket. Said it was evidence. Said what? Evidence, sir. That was the word. You were quite solemn about it. I was aware of Anne's eyes resting on me in an expression impossible to interpret without encouragement. And Mr. Chudley, Anne pressed. Did you see him? The maid nodded. Came out just before the trouble. The quiet gentleman in the dark coat was waiting for him at the mews end with another rougher sort. The rough one took Mr. Chudley off toward Bruton Street. The quieter one did not go with them. He turned back up the alley, just as the scuffle broke, and was there in the middle of it a moment after. Mr. Chudley was not exactly pulled, miss, but he was not exactly walking free either. Did anyone give chase? Cook said the mews turn takes you out quicker than the front. I stood very still. Then Charles did not leave by the front entrance at all, but by the back. It seems likely, said Anne. Pip, immensely pleased with himself, was now attempting to force his way into the kitchen in the hope, no doubt, of independent reward. We returned to the taxi and began a systematic search of my pockets, coat, and person. I now had a very different feeling about the contents of my own clothes from the one I had entertained earlier in the morning. Either I had stuffed something important into them last night, or something important had been stuffed into them by another hand while I was in no fit state to notice. In the inner pocket of my overcoat, folded twice and damp at the corners, we found a visiting card. Blank on one side. On the other, in pencil, 3 words. Half Moon Lane. Anne took it from me. Do you know it? No, nor I. It may be where Charles went. Or where you meant to go after losing the glove. That too, I admitted. The name suggested any number of obscure little streets, alleys, or mews scattered across London. It was an irritatingly incomplete clue. Yet it was more than we had possessed an hour before. Complete clue. Yet it was more than we had possessed an hour before. Which, according to the maid, you took into your keeping. Yes. And the veiled lady. Yes. And the man outside the hotel. I frowned. The two may be connected. Or not. We had reached that difficult stage in an inquiry when every fresh fact breeds 2 theories, and both appear capable of ruining the other. As we were standing beside the taxi, Pip suddenly sprang up, paws against my coat, and began to whine and scratch at the lower pocket. What now? I reached in. Out came, of all things, a watch. At least I thought for one hopeful instant it was my watch. Then I saw at once that it was not. The case was silver where mine was gold, and engraved inside the lid were the initials, CV. Anne drew a short breath. Cynthia Vale. The bride? Yes. I stared at the thing. How in heaven's name did her watch come to be in my pocket? That, said Anne very dryly, is not a question you will want asked in a drawing-room full of relations. For a moment neither of us spoke. The implications, though perhaps innocent in reality, were dreadful in appearance. The missing bridegroom. A veiled lady. The bride's watch in my pocket. It was exactly the sort of collection from which scandal may be assembled by persons of leisure. I never saw it before, I said. I believe you. That was gratifying. Thank you. Do not be too pleased. I believe you because no woman would secretly entrust such a matter to a man who cannot keep track of his own boots. This, though severe, had the merit of restoring me to the practical. Then the watch was planted, or thrust into your hand in confusion. I tried again to recover the missing stretch of night and got only broken impressions. A narrow alley, raised voices, someone stumbling against me hard from behind, Pip barking furiously, my own ridiculous determination to manage everyone at once, and then only the dark-coated man's tidy profile in the light from a kitchen door, calm as a clerk taking inventory. That fellow at the hotel, I said slowly. The one in the dark coat. He was in the alley, too. The maid saw him. Yes. If he pushed past me in the muddle, he could have dropped the watch into your pocket as easily as lifting one out. And the glove with it. We looked at each other. It was the ugly shape of a thing half seen. We must speak to Cynthia Vale, I said. Anne hesitated. She is at her aunt's house, dressing under supervision, and I imagine already half offended. With the truth? Possibly. With shock? Not this morning. I nodded. That was well judged. There are people to whom reality must be administered in spoonfuls, not from a fire hose. Very well, then first we trace Half Moon Lane. And the glove? It must still be in my coat somewhere. We shall turn it out properly when we have a table and fewer cab drivers. Pip barked once, sharp and triumphant, as though endorsing the plan. I looked down at him. My dear fellow, you are earning your keep. Anne's eyes rested on me with a curious expression. Amusement, approval, perhaps something warmer just beneath. Captain Hastings, I begin to suspect that if this wedding is saved, it will be by the dog. That, I returned, is gross ingratitude. The dog has ability, certainly, but he lacks method. Yes, she said. That must be why he works so well with you. And with that, she stepped into the taxi, leaving me no reply worthy of the occasion. I followed her in, with Pip between us and the bride's watch, like a small silver accusation in my pocket, and as we drove off toward the next clue, I could not rid myself of the feeling that beneath the comedy of the thing, something genuinely dangerous had begun to show its outline. Chapter 4. False Scandal, Real Trouble. Half Moon Lane turned out not to be one place but three. There was a Half Moon Lane in Kensington, a Half Moon Lane in Bermondsey, and a Half Moon Passage in Bloomsbury. The Kensington address proved useless. The Bermondsey Lane was a narrow run of warehouses by the river containing any amount of crates but no trace of Charles. It was in Bloomsbury, therefore, and with the clock already pressing cruelly toward one, that fortune at last decided to make a proper appearance. Half Moon Passage was one of those thin London cut-throughs that seem designed for secretive men in soft hats and women who do not wish to be seen arriving. At one end stood a tobacconist, at the other a mews entrance, and halfway down a discreet brass plate beside a door. Mr. Alistair Peebles, confidential inquiries and private correspondence. I halted before it. "Well," I said, "that has the look of trouble." Anne read the plate and lifted her brows. Not romantic, at all events. No. Worse. Professional. A private inquiry office, the very thing for bad debts, family scandals, and information men wish to purchase without asking directly for dirt. Pip, who had been merely tolerating Bloomsbury, now became animated. He put his nose to the step, whined, and scratched once. "He knows this place," Anne said, "or dislikes it. Dogs are often sounder judges than people. That is becoming a theme with you." We went in. The office consisted of a waiting room whose one potted fern had long ago given up, and an inner chamber furnished with a desk, a filing cabinet, and the kind of brown carpet that implies secrecy without prosperity. The man behind the desk rose as we entered. He was the very image of anonymous respectability, smooth hair, discreet tie, pale, careful face, and a voice trained to reveal nothing unless paid. "Mr. Peebles?" He inclined his head. "Yes?" I introduced myself and Anne, but before I had reached the point of my inquiry, his gaze sharpened very slightly. "You are connected with Mr. Charles Chudley." It was not a question. "Yes," Anne said. "Where is he?" Mr. Peebles spread out 2 fingers upon the desk. "I regret that I cannot discuss a client's affairs." "Client?" I said sharply. "Then he was here." I did not say so. "You may as well. The dog has identified the premises." Mr. Peebles looked at Pip with an expression I have often seen men reserve for inconvenient children and clergy. "I do not accept dogs as legal evidence." "No," said Anne, "but you probably accept clocks. It is now 20 minutes to 1. Mr. Charles Chudley is due to be married at 2. If he is in some scrape, and if you know where he is, you are no longer preserving confidence. You are assisting disaster." That was very well put. Peebles glanced from her to me, and I think revised downward his estimate of our harmlessness. "I am not assisting disaster, Miss Foster. On the contrary, I was engaged to prevent one." My heart gave a leap. "Engaged by whom?" He hesitated just too long. "By Mr. Chudley, last week. At his request, I made certain inquiries into a matter connected with the Vale family." Anne stiffened. "The bride's family?" "Yes." This at once changed the color of everything. Until then, the easiest theory had been that Charles had some old entanglement, some secret debt, some last-minute weakness. But if he had hired a private inquiry agent concerning his bride's family, then the business was of another order altogether. "What matter?" Anne asked. Peebles removed his spectacles, polished them, and put them on again. A gentleman connected with the Vales had for some months been under financial pressure. Certain papers existed which, if revealed publicly on the wedding day, might have produced considerable unpleasantness. "Blackmail," I said. Peebles made a minimal gesture. "The word is coarse, but substantially fair." "And Charles discovered this?" "Yes, through channels I need not detail." "Who was being blackmailed?" "Miss Vale's brother." "Stephen Vale?" I exclaimed. "The insufferably polished one from last night?" "The same gentleman." I confess I was shocked, though in retrospect perhaps I ought not to have been. Easy assurance often means only that a man has long practice at concealing the bill. Anne was very pale now, but her voice remained steady. "And Charles went to deal with it himself." "He insisted on it. I had advised him strongly against direct involvement. I had arranged a meeting this morning to discuss the transfer of certain documents in return for immediate settlement. Mr. Chudley, however, received new information last night which suggested the person holding the material meant to force the issue before the wedding." "The note," I said. "Yes. "A note from a veiled lady." Peebles actually looked surprised. "Lady?" "Yes, sent to the Marischal Rooms." "Then that was not from me. I sent no messenger to the Marischal Rooms." That pulled the whole thing sideways again. Anne spoke first. Then someone else, knowing of the matter, forced him out. Peebles nodded reluctantly. "So it appears." "Who held the documents?" I demanded. He opened a drawer, took out a card and pushed it across. "Mr. Lionel Vane, solicitor." The name meant nothing to me, but Anne gave a slight start. "I know it. He acted once for Lady Eleanor's late husband in a shipping dispute. Mother disliked him." "Lady Eleanor knew him? At least by name." That opened yet another door. Then he had access to both families. "Yes." I turned back to Peebles. "What documents?" The man's reserve was fraying. Perhaps he saw now that silence would not save anyone. "Letters, and one signed acknowledgement of debt. Young Mr. Vale borrowed heavily 2 years ago, partly to cover speculation, partly to suppress a previous indiscretion. Vane acquired the papers. When the marriage between Miss Vale and Mr. Chudley was announced, he saw an opportunity." "To extort Charles?" "To extort someone. Mr. Chudley learned enough to know that if the thing broke publicly, it would disgrace the bride's family before the ceremony. He was determined to prevent that." Anne let out her breath very slowly. "That fool," she said softly. It was not contempt. It was something more affectionate and more exasperated than contempt ever manages. "Where is Vane?" I said. "I was to meet him at 1 o'clock at his chambers near the Temple. But if Chudley went to him during the night—" He did not finish. He did not need to. At this point, Pip, who had hitherto conducted himself with professional reserve, began a distinct agitation. He put one paw on my shoe, withdrew it, pressed his nose against my coat, and pushed at the outside of my side pocket. I felt it then. The weight wrong on one side. I had sat down heavily on entering, and had been too full of Peebles's disclosures to register the small unfamiliar lump against my ribs. Pip was only telling me to check what I ought to have checked an hour ago. "Turn it out," said Anne. I did. From the pocket, crumpled, slightly damp, and smelling faintly of something ladylike which I shall not attempt to describe, there came into my hand a small glove. A glove of pale kid. Inside, stamped in gold, the initials C.V. "The bride's glove," I said. "Yes." "In my pocket." "Yes." For one long second, none of us moved. Peebles leaned forward. "May I see?" I handed him the watch as well. For the first time, the fellow lost composure outright. "Then Vane has been playing a nastier game than I thought. I had assumed he meant only to squeeze Mr. Chudley for a signature. This goes further." "How so?" I asked. Peebles drew a slow breath. "Because if those items, watch, glove, anything personal to the bride, were found in compromising circumstances on a gentleman of the Stag party, it would suggest a private understanding between bride and groom before the wedding night, a secret meeting, perhaps even collusion, enough to muddy the waters, enough to provoke a scene." "A vulgar little scandal," said Anne. "Exactly. The real matter, the debt, Stephen Vale, hidden beneath a false one that would make everyone look at the bride and the groomsman instead." Anne had lifted the watch between 2 fingers and was now turning it slowly. "One thing more, Mr. Peebles. Things of this sort do not walk out of a girl's dressing case on their own. Someone inside the house put them into Vane's hands." "The brother," I said slowly. "Possibly. Or a servant, or an accomplice. But I would begin with the brother." Peebles glanced between us. "You may be right. That would be uglier still." "At the groomsman?" I said, and stopped. Anne looked at me quietly. "You, Captain Hastings." Had you wandered into the church this afternoon with a lady's watch and glove on your person, I doubt any aunt in either family would have asked questions gently. That took a moment to digest. I struck the desk lightly with my hand. So Charles was lured out under cover of a romantic intrigue, but in fact went to stop Vane from using Stephen Vale's debt papers. Meanwhile, I was set up as a convenient scandal in reserve. "That is my reading of it," said Peebles. "And Miss Vale herself?" "Innocent, I should think. Unless she is a far better actress than society allows." That sounded right. Cynthia had struck me as lively, and perhaps a bit sharp, but not devious. The planted glove and watch had all the smell of manipulation about them. Cold, precise, entirely of a piece with the clean-shaven man on the pavement. "Then there is no love affair," I said. Anne looked at me with a mixture of patience and triumph. "No, Captain Hastings, there usually is not." I had the decency to feel rebuked. "We go to Vane at once?" "One moment," said Peebles. "There is more." He opened another drawer and produced a folded paper. "This arrived for Mr. Chudley at 11 this morning, delivered here by messenger. I had no means of sending it on." I snatched it up. In a cramped lawyer's hand were written only 2 lines. "If you want the original signed paper, come alone. 1:30. Water stairs behind Essex Street. The river." Of course. A lawyer with dirty business, a missing man, the edge of the city, and the Thames waiting to swallow embarrassment like old wine. Anne read over my shoulder. 1:30, that gives us very little time. Peebles rose. "I advise the police." "So do I," said Anne at once. "Certainly," I said, "but not instead of going." She turned on me. "You do not imagine you are going alone?" "My dear Miss Foster, water stairs and blackmailers are not a fit destination for—" "For women? Or for useful intelligence?" "That is not what I meant." "No, you meant to protect me." "Yes." "How tiresome." Peebles coughed discreetly. "If I may, Miss Foster has the better of the argument. Mr. Vane is less likely to suspect a trap if you arrive not as an avenger, but as a worried friend and a lady." I disliked this, partly because it was true, and partly because the thought of Anne among such people was intolerable. Still, there was no time for male vanity. "Very well," I said, "but we proceed carefully." At this, Pip barked once, as though endorsing the expedition. Anne slipped the glove into her bag and looked at me with that bright, hard steadiness which always put me on my mettle. "Captain Hastings, you have been wrong about almost everything since breakfast." "That is an exaggeration." "A modest one, but on one point you were right. Charles may indeed have gone to save someone else from scandal." I nodded. "And now we must save him from the consequences of trying." We left Peebles's office at once. Peebles himself stepped into the passage to telephone the station, Anne having supplied with admirable economy the name of Inspector Morton, and then followed us as far as the tobacconist's corner, with the air of a man who had finally decided which side he was on. The taxi ride to the Temple was one of those journeys in which London seems determined to remind a man that it is a city built long before his urgency. Omnibuses clogged the crossings. Vans lurched. A policeman held up 2 streams of traffic, while an old lady crossed with the unhurried privilege of her sex and generation. Every lost minute seemed to me a personal insult. Anne, however, remained composed, though I could see in the tightness of her clasped hands that her calm was now maintained by effort. "Tell me one thing," I said. "What?" "Why are you so certain Charles did not simply run?" She looked out at the passing streets. "Because he is weak in the ordinary ways and stubborn in the essential ones. He might have lost his nerve before the wedding." "Yes, for half an hour. Then he would have written, or telephoned, or sent word to his mother. He would not leave her undefended before a church full of veils." I could not help smiling. "You know him rather well." I know people who are trying very hard to be better than they have been." There was enough in that sentence to keep a fellow quiet. When at last we drew up near Essex Street, the sky had gone white over the river, and the air carried that damp metallic smell peculiar to the Thames. The water stairs lay below us, narrow and greasy with age, half hidden behind warehouses and legal buildings that turned their respectable backs upon the mud. No place for a wedding-day errand, no place for a bridegroom. And yet I knew, even before we descended, that we were close now, very close indeed, to the true centre of the matter. Chapter 5. Hastings in Pursuit. It is one of the defects of civilization that the more respectable a district appears from the front, the more disreputable its back portions are liable to become. Essex Street, approached from the Strand, wears the sober countenance of law, papers, chambers, fees, and mild ruin conducted upon stamped forms. But behind it, where the old water stairs slope down to the Thames, there lingers another London altogether, older, muddier, and far less concerned with appearances. The stones were slick beneath our feet. The tide was low, leaving strips of black ooze between the steps and the grey, sluggish wash of the river. A lighter bumped against a mooring post below, with a hollow, patient sound. I went first. Anne followed without fuss, her hand lightly on the rail, and Pip, with absurd confidence, negotiated the descent as though born to riverside intrigue. There was no one immediately visible. A waterman in a cap sat smoking by an archway farther along, but gave us only a bored glance and looked away again. An empty handcart stood by the wall. The river moved with the air of knowing too much and intending to say nothing. 1:30, I said under my breath, and no sign of them. Perhaps we are early. Or late. Pip gave a low whine and pulled toward the right, where the stairs flattened into a narrow path beneath the buildings. We had gone only a few yards when a voice said sharply, "Stand where you are." A man stepped out from the shadow of a buttress. I stopped short, and in that instant, with the small cold click of a lock turning in the mind, I saw him properly for the first time. Long, dry, clean-shaven face, brushed hat. Legal whisker lines gone out of fashion, lingering out of stubbornness rather than style. The unpleasantly tidy appearance of a fellow who expects everyone else to become flurried first. "Good God," I said. "You were outside the hotel." He permitted himself the faintest acknowledgement. "I wondered whether you would know me by daylight, Captain Hastings. You were in no state to remember much after midnight. You spoke to Charles on the pavement." "I did." "You were in the alley later." "I was." "And you put that watch into my pocket." Vane smiled in the thin way of men who have never been properly hit. "Let us say the matter arranged itself. You were obliging. You were very obliging." Anne's voice, when it came, was colder than I had yet heard it. "You are Mr. Lionel Vane." "I have that honour." "Then you should be aware that your address and your arrangements for this afternoon are known to Mr. Peebles, to Inspector Morton, and to me. If you were counting upon the discretion of the Thames, I am afraid you will be disappointed." Vane's eyes flicked past her, and for the first time I saw in him a flicker of calculation rather than contempt. There was movement then from below the stairs, and another man came up from near the waterline. He was broad-shouldered and wore a rough coat such as dock men affect when they wish to seem invisible. Between them, hatless, pale, mud on one sleeve, stood Charles Chudley. "Charles!" Anne cried. He started violently, then looked up with an expression so mixed, relief, alarm, embarrassment, that I knew at once he had not run away, nor was he master of the situation. "Hastings? Miss Foster? Good Lord, what are you doing here?" "Saving you, I hope, though I admit the method is still developing." Charles made as if to come up, but the broad man touched his elbow in a manner outwardly civil and inwardly coercive. "Steady, sir," he muttered. That was enough for me. "Take your hand off him." Vane lifted one palm. "Please. Nothing theatrical. Mr. Chudley is here of his own will." "My own infernal will," Charles said bitterly. "At least at first." Anne's voice cut through it. "What have they done with you?" Charles looked from her to me, and for the first time I saw in him not nerves, not social discomfort, but genuine self-disgust. I made a muddle of it. The note came in the middle of supper. A veiled lady at the door of the Marischal Rooms, a few lines in a woman's hand implying the bride wished to meet me privately and naming a place off the Strand. I thought what a fool of my sort always thinks. Also, Peebles could not move till morning, and Vane had sent word that if I were not at the Marischal door by midnight, the papers would be at the church door by breakfast. 8 hours of stalling seemed the lesser disaster. I was wrong about most things that night. There was no lady, there was Vane, and that man, and 2 narrow stairs up into a back room somewhere behind Charing Cross, an empty solicitor's cellar with a stove, a deal table and a window that did not open. They kept me there through the night, not tied, not beaten, merely prevented. Every time I said I must send word to Mother, Vane slid a paper across the table and invited me to sign first. A draft indemnity, he called it. I refused. I did have one useful moment. When they turned me round at the Mews end to take me off, I got Peebles's card into your coat pocket, Hastings. You were drunk as an owl, and I doubt you felt it, but I hoped you would find it sober. Then at daylight, Vane said the morning train would bring matters to a point, and we came here. He wanted me compliant by the time the wedding drew near, and it very nearly worked, because compliance begins to look remarkably like sense when one has not slept and one's mother is waiting in a church. Stephen's debt paper, letters, some of them damned compromising, though not in the way you'd think, he added. Vane swore if the money were paid and the originals recovered, the whole affair ended there. And instead, I said. Instead, he insisted on a signed acknowledgement from me, temporary, he called it, guaranteeing certain further sums if ever any whisper of the business touched the Vale name after the marriage. Blackmail after marriage as well as before it, said Anne. Very neat. Vane inclined his head. I prefer the word indemnity. You prefer whatever word allows you to sleep, said Anne. There are moments when a well-bred woman can deliver more damage in 6 syllables than a regiment of men with clubs. Vane's face altered slightly. Not much, but enough to show he had felt it. Miss Foster, he said, your opinions do not alter the position. No, I said, but perhaps this does. And I stepped smartly between him and Charles. What followed began because Pip suddenly launched himself at the broad man's trouser leg, and the fellow swore, jerked backward, and knocked into Charles. I caught him by one arm, shoved him behind me, and struck the broad man's forearm with my stick, not elegantly, but effectively enough to make him let out a howl and snatch his hand back. Vane moved sideways, perhaps to run, perhaps to seize the papers from Charles's coat, but Anne was nearer than he expected, and stepped directly into his path with the kind of perfect composure that is more obstructive than panic ever can be. You will not pass, she said. He actually hesitated. That gave me half a second, which is often all a man gets. Charles! Papers! I shouted. Charles, to his credit, recovered himself instantly, dragged a folded sheaf from inside his coat, and thrust it at Anne. The broad man made then for the stairs, perhaps judging the dog the lesser danger and me the larger. I caught him round the middle and drove him back against the wall. He smelled of damp rope and bad tobacco, and fought without much science. I caught him once under the ribs. That improved his attitude considerably. Meanwhile, Pip, that small and ferocious professional, had transferred his operations to Vane's immaculate trouser leg. Charles, finding at last some backbone worthy of the day, seized Vane by the wrist. "Enough of this. You've had all the advantage you're going to get." At that moment came the sound which every innocent man loves and every guilty one hates: running boots and a constable's shout. Inspector Morton, whom Peebles had telephoned from Bloomsbury, arrived with 2 uniformed men and the waterman from the archway, who had apparently found civic spirit at the very instant it became entertaining. The broad man ceased resisting at once. Vane attempted dignity. "There has been some misunderstanding." "There has," I said, panting rather more than was ideal. "You appear to have mistaken extortion for legal practice." Morton, who had earlier that morning seemed to me an unimaginative ass, now looked gratifyingly official. "Take them both." Vane tried once more. "I protest most strongly. I am a solicitor." "Yes," said Anne. "That has been the difficulty throughout." If I live to be 100, I shall not forget the expression on his face. The thing, once broken, settled quickly. The broad man proved to be a clerk or collector in Vane's employ. The papers in Anne's possession included Stephen Vale's signed acknowledgement of debt, several letters from Vane naming terms, and, to my surprise, a second smaller packet tied with string. "What's that?" I asked. Charles reddened. "That's the idiotic part. The proof they had in reserve against us if I refused to sign." I turned to Vane. "And the woman? The one who left the note at the Marischal Rooms?" Vane had recovered enough of himself by then to find malice the only comfort remaining to him. "A shop girl, Captain Hastings, from a tobacconist's I had used for small errands before. 10 shillings, a borrowed cloak, and a veil. She did not know what was in the note, and could not describe me if her livelihood depended on it, which is fortunate for her." "And the hand?" said Anne. "The note was in a woman's writing." Vane's smile thinned to something unpleasant. "I wrote it myself, Miss Foster. A solicitor who cannot imitate a lady's hand for a half-page has no business in private work." Anne drew a short breath. I saw her fingers tighten briefly on the recovered packet. So the veiled lady was only an errand. Only an errand. And the thought that she might have been Miss Vale in secret was manufactured by you and no one else. "Manufactured," said Vane, with the dry precision of a man reading a contract, "is a vulgar word. Arranged, rather." Morton opened the packet tied with string. Inside were the original debt paper, 3 letters from Stephen Vale, and, of all things, a matching pale kid glove and a little silver watch chain. "There," said Anne quietly. "The reserve scandal." Charles stared at them. "So that's how they meant to do it?" "Yes," I said. "If I had not found the first pair in my pocket this morning, watch and glove together, the second pair were ready to appear somewhere compromising as soon as Vane decided when. A spare set, in case the first was scrubbed in the wash." Morton glanced over the material and frowned. "This is enough to hold them, I think. Mr. Vane, you may explain the rest in proper surroundings." Vane, seeing the game lost, turned venomous. "You are all fools. The marriage will not survive a month with this kind of weakness under it." "Perhaps not," said Anne, "but at least it will begin without you." That ended him better than handcuffs. Once the police had taken charge and the necessary names were written down, we stood for a brief moment on the stairs together, Charles mud-stained and disordered, Anne still clutching the recovered packet, Pip panting with professional satisfaction, and I hatless, coat torn at one seam, but conscious of having done at least one useful thing with conviction. "Well," I said, "the good news is that you have not deserted your bride." "Yes," said Charles, "only misplaced half the day, and nearly ruined the other half." "It is not ideal," Anne admitted. He looked at his watchless wrist, then at the sky, and went suddenly white. "My God, the time?" I looked too, nearly 2. There followed one of those rapid and undignified movements by which lives are sometimes improved. Morton procured us a taxi with the authority of the police. Charles was bundled into it, Anne beside him, Pip on her lap, and I opposite, still breathing hard and wishing there were time to restore at least some minimum order to my appearance. "There is one thing more," Anne said as the cab jolted away. "What?" She held up the recovered glove, the one Pip had pulled from my own pocket in Peebles's office, still tucked in her reticule. "This must go back to Cynthia before any aunt finds reason to count her accessories." Charles groaned. "She will murder me." "Quite likely," I said, "but first she will marry you." For the first time since I had seen him, he laughed. It was a worn laugh, but genuine. Then he turned to Anne. "You came after me yourself." "Evidently. I do not deserve friends like that." "No," she said, "but one makes allowances on wedding days." Her tone was dry, but not entirely. There are moments when kindness is best expressed in a form the recipient will not immediately misuse. As for me, I sat back, bruised, torn, and inwardly triumphant. I had been wrong on several theories, had at one point carried 2 crucial clues in my own pocket, without understanding either, and had very likely looked a fool in 3 separate districts of London. But I had found Charles, broken the trap, and helped bring the villains to book. And yet, even then, another thought had begun to trouble me. How was the truth to be told? For Stephen Vale's debt paper was recovered, yes, but Stephen remained Stephen, the bride remained innocent, and the wedding, if it was to go forward without scandal, must somehow be saved without blowing up both families upon the church steps. In other words, the pursuit was over. The real difficulty, the social one, was only just beginning. Chapter 6. The Wedding Saved. I have always maintained that physical danger, though unpleasant, is at least simple. A man knows where he is with a falling shell, a charging bull, or even a blackmailer's accomplice by the river. These things may kill one, but they do not also insist upon seating plans, propriety, floral arrangements, and the susceptibilities of 2 connected families in their best clothes. Society, when pressed for time, is much the more terrifying enemy. The Church of St. Jude's, Chelsea, stood in a state of disciplined expectancy when we arrived. There were motor cars before the gate, hats within hats upon the pavement, ushers already looking strained, and that faint electric murmur particular to weddings when half the congregation suspect something has gone wrong and are trying to enjoy it morally. Our taxi had scarcely stopped before Anne was out, Pip under one arm, and the recovered glove in her reticule. Charles sat for one appalled second as though contemplating flight in the abstract. Then I seized him by the lapel. "My dear fellow," I said, "you have done enough vanishing for one day. Out." He obeyed. If ever a man looked less like a bridegroom and more like the survivor of a shipping accident, it was Charles Chudley at that moment. His collar was gone, his sleeve mud-streaked, and his hat had ceased to resemble anything sold in civilized premises, yet there was no help for it. A missing groom restored in disarray is still preferable to a missing groom not restored at all. Lady Eleanor met us in the vestry passage. I shall not soon forget her face. All the proud control of the morning was still there, but worn now so thin that one could see the fear beneath it like candlelight through paper. When she saw Charles, she did not cry out, did not embrace him, did not make a scene. She merely closed her eyes once and put a hand to the wall. Then she opened them again and said, in a perfectly level voice, "So, you have chosen at last to behave like a son and not a headline." Charles took her hand. "Mother, I am sorry beyond words." "Yes, that is clear from the condition of you." Her gaze passed to me, then to Anne, then to Pip, whose tongue hung out in a fashion unbecoming to the gravity of the occasion. "Captain Hastings, I trust there is an explanation." "There is, but not one for the knave." Lady Eleanor's eyes sharpened. "Good. Then we shall have it in 3 minutes, and the wedding in 6. This, I thought, was one of the finest sentences ever spoken by a woman under pressure. We got Charles into the vestry room. Someone produced water. Someone else fetched a brush. A terrified verger surrendered a collar. It is extraordinary what can be done to restore a man to public decency when 6 determined persons move at once and no one allows him a mirror. While this was taking place, Stephen Vale arrived. He came in quick and pale, with all his usual assurance scraped clean off him. One look at Charles, one at Anne, one at me, and he knew. Men always know when the truth has reached the room ahead of them. "Has it?" he began. "Yes," said Anne. "It has." He shut the door behind him and for a moment stood with his back to it, as though the door itself were the last piece of composure he possessed. Lady Eleanor turned on him then with a quietness I should not care to face myself. "Your affairs, Mr. Vale, have cost my son his wedding morning, my household a day of near disgrace, and Captain Hastings his hat." It was beautifully arranged, that descending order. Stephen flushed darkly. "My lady, I can only say—" "No, you can say very little, because if you say too much before the ceremony, I may decide to cancel it." He stopped at once. That checked even me. A thought that had been sitting at the back of my mind since Peebles's office had grown a good deal heavier on the way from the river. I turned to him with it full on my tongue. "Mr. Vale, one thing ought to be on record before the organ starts. Your sister's watch and glove were not forced out of her dressing case by Vane. They were supplied to him by someone who knew where such things were kept. Was that you?" He did not answer at once, which was an answer in itself. "Yes," he said at last. "He demanded a token. I gave him 2. From my sister's room." Anne's head moved a fraction. Lady Eleanor did not move at all. "To be planted on whomever Vane chose. He did not tell me how they would be used. It suited me not to ask." "A perfect understanding," said Anne. Stephen looked at her as a dog looks at someone it has bitten. I thought, if Charles could be made to sign, my own papers would go back in the drawer. The rest was not my business. "No," said Lady Eleanor. "Nothing in this affair has been your business except the part you sold." There was a silence then, of the sort that arranges a man's life for him in about 6 seconds. Charles spoke first, and I was proud of him for it. "Mother, whatever else is decided, Cynthia is not to be told before the ceremony. Not this, not today." "I had not proposed to tell her before the ceremony," said Lady Eleanor. "That would be cruelty in a white dress. But afterwards—" Her eyes moved back to Stephen and stayed there. "Afterwards, Mr. Vale, your debts will be cleared, by Charles if necessary, and by me if not, on terms which will be explained in writing. In return, you will remove yourself from London for not less than 2 years. India, perhaps, or the colonies. Somewhere inconvenient enough to discourage you from returning socially improved. You will sit through the service, because to withdraw now would start the very scandal we are preventing. After the bells, you will disappear, and remain disappeared at my convenience." It was not cruelty. It was something colder and much more effective. A sentence from the bench. Stephen's face went through 2 or 3 colours before settling on an ashen sort of obedience. "And Cynthia," he managed. "Cynthia will be told in her own time and by me as much of the truth as a wife can bear of a brother. Not today, not tomorrow, perhaps not this year. But she will be told because she is going to be a Chudley. And in this family we do not build a marriage on a secret the husband carries alone." Charles closed his eyes briefly. Whether in relief or in awe, I could not tell. It fell then to me to state the essentials for the public record. I explained Vane's attempt at extortion, the debt papers, the false trail, Charles's foolish effort to settle matters alone, and the recovery of the documents before any public use could be made of them. I omitted certain details of the riverside encounter which would have been more vivid than useful, and likewise the fact that I had carried 2 of the crucial clues in my own coat for several hours, without comprehending either. A man need not volunteer every truth at once. Lady Eleanor listened without a word until I had finished. Then she nodded once. Very well. This is what will be said publicly. Captain Hastings, you will repeat when asked that Charles was called away on an urgent matter involving a legal nuisance connected with property papers, and that the thing has now been settled. That explanation is dull enough to be believed. Anne, you will return Miss Vale's glove to her dressing room before the bridesmaids count. Charles. Yes, mother? You will marry the girl, thank God for her, and afterward you will begin the long and honourable labour of ceasing to be an idiot. Charles actually smiled. Yes, mother. It was settled with military speed after that. Anne slipped away toward Cynthia. Stephen vanished into the front of the church, where I imagine he arranged his face into some expression of brotherly support only slightly at variance with collapse. Lady Eleanor remained in the vestry with Charles for a moment alone, and I, finding myself suddenly superfluous, stood with Pip in the passage feeling bruised, dusty, and very oddly content. Pip sat on my shoe. "You have done rather well," I told him. He yawned. A voice behind me said, "That is what I was about to tell you." I turned. Anne had returned. For 1 second the noise of the church, the movement of people, the whole fever of the afternoon seemed to draw back a little. She looked tired now, but the kind of tiredness that follows effort honestly spent. There was a loosened brightness in her expression I had not seen before. "Well, is the bride still willing?" "She is angry." "With Charles?" "Deeply." "That sounds promising." "It is." I hesitated. "And her glove?" "Restored." I told her she had misplaced it in the confusion. "Did she believe that?" Anne's mouth curved. "No. But she accepted it, which in women is often more useful." I laughed. "My dear Miss Foster, I do not know how I should have managed this day without you." "Badly," she said at once. Then more gently, "But not dishonourably." That pleased me more than I can say. The organ began then. A stir passed through the church. The thing, by some miracle of will, secrecy, and narrowed margins, was going forward. Charles came out of the vestry a transformed man, not because he looked especially polished, though the hurried repairs had done wonders, but because some of the self-consciousness had gone out of him. He looked instead what he ought to have looked from the first, serious, slightly frightened, and wholly resolved. As he passed us, he paused. "Hastings." "Yes." "I owe you more than I can say." "You may begin," I replied, "by standing still long enough to be married." He gave a short laugh and went in. The ceremony itself I shall not describe in detail. Weddings belong more properly to those directly netted by them, and besides, I was by then too occupied observing the congregation to behave sentimentally. There were faces alert with curiosity, faces softened by relief, and one formidable aunt whose expression suggested that if the service had been delayed 2 minutes more, she would have denounced the clergy. Cynthia Vale came up the aisle with excellent colour and composure. If she had guessed that her mourning stood within an inch of ruin, she gave no sign beyond a very slight additional gravity in the eyes. When she reached Charles and he looked at her, I saw at once that whatever nonsense he had made of the day, his feeling for her was real enough. That, in the end, is the only useful thing in marriage. The flowers, uniforms, cake, speeches and silver are merely camouflage. Pip, I regret to say, contributed a small disturbance by escaping my hold and trotting 3 pews forward during the second hymn, where he was captured by a bridesmaid who at once fell in love with him. This, however, only improved matters. There is no social crisis so severe that a spaniel may not soften it by 12%. Afterward there was the usual confusion of congratulations, rice, hats, gloves, and people calling for cars in tones of false calm. I was dragged into several handshakes I had not earned, and one embrace from Pritchard, who had by then arrived and heard only that there had been some beastly legal nuisance, which I had somehow sorted. "Well done, old man," he boomed. "Knew you'd get to the bottom of it. Fellow can always trust a soldier." One cannot correct a major in public. It is socially impossible. Stephen Vale passed me once in the crush, paler than a man ought to be at his sister's wedding, and inclined his head with a precision that was almost courteous. I did not return the inclination. There is a point at which civility becomes collusion, and I was not yet willing to reach it. He understood. He went on. Lady Eleanor came to me last. She held out her hand in that grave, stately fashion of hers. "Captain Hastings, I am in your debt." "My dear Lady Eleanor." "No. Let us not make a false show of modesty on both sides. You have preserved my son from humiliation, my future daughter-in-law from an ugly scene, and this family from becoming anecdote." "I had help," I said honestly. "Yes," she replied, glancing toward Anne, who stood a little apart speaking to Cynthia. "That too is clear." There was something in her expression then, approval, perhaps, or the beginning of an idea. Mothers are the devil for ideas. Before I could be more closely inspected, the vicarage telephone was brought to me by a breathless curate. "A Monsieur Poirot for Captain Hastings." Only Poirot could contrive to sound inevitable even through clergy. "Hastings?" "Yes." "You are alive." "Plainly." "And the wedding?" "Saved." There was a tiny pause in which I could hear, even down the line, the smile in his voice. "And by what means?" "Heroic deduction, psychology, the order and method." "By practical action, tracing clues, confronting villains, recovering documents, restoring the groom." "Indeed? And the little dog?" I hesitated. "He was useful." "I thought so." There is no conceit in the world like that of a man who has been right from an armchair. "If you must know, Pip identified one premises, recovered a glove from my own pocket in the middle of a solicitor's office, and bit a blackmailer." "Excellent. Then between you there was at least one detective." "My dear Poirot, I was the one who brought the thing to its conclusion." "Yes, yes. I do not deny you the courage. Only perhaps I reserve to myself the logic." He let me bristle for a second, then softened. "But well done all the same, mon ami. You have done what is rare for you. You have stopped trying to be me and been usefully yourself." That disarmed me more than praise would have done. "Thank you." "Do not sound so astonished. It is unbecoming. Goodbye." He rang off. I returned the receiver and came out into the churchyard, where the late afternoon had turned unexpectedly gold. The worst of the crowd had gone. The cars were departing. Charles and Cynthia had just driven off beneath a shower of rice and dubious advice. Pritchard was trying to persuade someone that every marriage ought to begin with a pistol range. Lady Eleanor was already restoring order to the remnants. Anne stood by the gate with Pip on the lead. "Well?" she asked. "Poirot is intolerable." That sounds as though he approved. He did. Then he must be very pleased indeed. I looked at her. "Miss Foster, Anne, there is something I have wanted to say since about noon, though I have been interrupted by extortion, riverside violence, and matrimony. She waited, not helping me in the least. I know I have looked a fool a good many times today. You have. Thank you. It seems best to keep to truth while the habit is upon us. Quite, but I hope I have not looked a coward. Her expression changed very slightly. No, never that. Then if you can forgive the confusion of the morning, the dog, the missing watch, the wrong theories, and the rest, I should very much like to take you to dinner one evening when no one is missing, blackmailing, or being married. Pip sat down between us and looked from one face to the other, as he had done that morning, with the air of a being prepared to judge the result. At last, Anne said, "That depends on whether you mean to arrive with only one dog and your own watch." I laughed. "My own watch, certainly. The dog, I fear, may insist." "Then," she said, and now she was smiling openly, "I think it may be arranged. There are moments in life which, if one has any gratitude in one's composition at all, one recognizes as complete. The thing need not be grand. It need only be sound. This, for me, was such a moment. The wedding had been saved. The villains had been taken. Charles, by some providential mercy, had reached the altar in time. And I, who had begun the day with a dead head, a strange dog in my bed, and no memory worth the name, found myself standing in the quiet after the storm with a woman I admired, a spaniel at my feet, and just enough credit in the world to enjoy the afternoon honestly. Pip leaned against my leg. "Yes," I said to him, "very well. You may come too." And since the dog had certainly earned it, and perhaps so had I, that was how the matter ended. Epilogue. Dinner for 3. A week after the wedding, I found myself once more engaged in an enterprise requiring more courage than strategy. I refer to dinner. There are, no doubt, men to whom such occasions come easily. They select a restaurant without anguish, a necktie without consultation, and a conversational opening without spending 20 minutes rejecting superior versions of themselves in the mirror. I am not one of those men. At 6:30 I had already changed my tie twice and rejected one waistcoat for excessive solemnity. George, whose judgment in these matters is as dry as it is exact, spared me further deliberation by saying, while handing me my gloves, "A flower, sir, is best when one is already certain of success." I looked at him sharply. "And if one is not? Then it may appear hopeful." I abandoned the flower. Anne was to meet me at 7 outside a little restaurant in Jermyn Street that had the advantage of being quiet, discreet, and sufficiently good to suggest respect, without looking as though one had rented it for a proposal. I arrived 10 minutes early, which is my custom when I wish to seem casual, and stood under the awning, trying not to look like a man who had been waiting since the Reform Bill. London was mild for the season. The air held that agreeable evening softness, which makes women seem prettier, and men more optimistic than their circumstances justify. Lamps had begun to glow. Cabs slid past. Somewhere down the street a pianist was punishing a popular tune in a way that made one grateful for walls. Anne appeared exactly on time. She wore a dark blue coat and a small hat trimmed with something understated and expensive-looking, in a manner I have never properly understood but always admire. She looked, as she had a trick of doing, both entirely self-possessed and unexpectedly alive. There are women who enter a scene. Anne seemed merely to bring it into better focus. "Captain Hastings, you are punctual." "I am trying to improve." "Yes, I hear that happens to men after dramatic weeks." I laughed and took her in. "I am very glad you came." "That," she returned, "was clear from your note. Also from the fact that you posted it by hand." I had not known she would detect that. "My dear Miss Foster, Anne, There are forms which deserve respect. So I see. Her eyes flicked once to my tie. And I congratulate you. This one appears to have been chosen after struggle. I ought to have been offended. Instead, I found myself absurdly pleased that she noticed anything at all. Inside, the room was low-lit and pleasantly murmurous, with white tablecloths, polished glass, and no orchestra. I had chosen, as I say, with care. Anne approved it with a glance that seemed to me reward enough for the reservation alone. We had not been seated more than 3 minutes before I became aware of a difficulty. At the neighbouring table sat a gentleman who looked at me with the dawning recognition of one trying to place another man from some less orderly context. I could see the progress of his mind as plainly as if it had been projected on the wall. Then he brightened suddenly and said with cheerful confidence, "Dog." I stared. "Beg pardon?" "The little spaniel. You were the gentleman with the spaniel in the hotel lobby last week. Extraordinary little beast. Dashed, nearly took my cuff. How is he?" "Quite well, thank you." "Capital. Carry on." He returned to his soup, perfectly satisfied. I sat down again in a condition difficult to describe. Anne lifted her menu. "Well, your fame survives." In a form I had not anticipated. Perhaps better than the truth. "My dear Anne, I behaved with spirit." "Yes, and apparently with a dog." There was no help for it. I laughed. Once a woman has seen a man at his least composed and still consented to dine with him, much of the usual strain goes out of courtship. One is spared the necessity of looking grand and may settle for looking game. The first part of dinner went off remarkably well. We spoke not of the wedding at first, but of ordinary things. London, books, Lady Eleanor's restored peace, the fact that Charles and Cynthia had gone north for a fortnight where, Anne said, they can quarrel privately and begin respectability away from witnesses. I learned, too, that Anne had a brother in the Navy, an aunt in Bath whom she loved without esteeming, and a strong view that people who boast of practical good sense are generally those least likely to display it under pressure. "You include me in that?" I asked. I should be unjust if I did not. Surely I behaved practically in the end. In the end, yes. But one cannot overlook that your first contribution to the affair was to wake up with a dog and no memory. That, I said, was not so much a contribution as a condition. She smiled over her glass. "You have a talent, Captain Hastings, for turning disadvantage into tone." I was about to answer in a manner I hoped would combine modesty and charm when the waiter approached and murmured something at Anne. She looked faintly surprised. "For me?" The waiter nodded and handed her a folded note. It was impossible not to stiffen. "A note?" I said. She looked at me with complete innocence. "Do not tell me you have relapsed already into suspicion." "My dear Anne, after recent events I feel entitled to regard notes as unstable objects." She opened it. Her brows rose. Then she held it out to me. It read, "Miss Foster, Pip has escaped from the footman and is believed to be heading in your direction with determination. With apologies, Eleanor Chudley." I looked up. Anne said, "Well." At that exact moment there came from the doorway a familiar burst of scratching, a waitress's startled exclamation, and a small golden-brown projectile shot across the carpet with the speed and conviction of a creature obeying destiny. "Pip!" I cried. He reached our table, skidded slightly, and landed squarely upon my shoe with a gasp of canine triumph. His tail beat against my trouser leg. A fragment of ribbon hung absurdly from his collar, like the remains of some unsuccessful restraint. The room, to do it justice, took this very well. English restaurants are capable of seeing almost anything provided it arrives with enough confidence. Anne bent to gather up the lead trailing behind him. "Dinner for 3. "It would seem so." Pip, having secured the centre of operations, sat down between us and looked about with the composure of a small clubman who has found his table already laid. I confess I was delighted. There is something immensely cheering in being chosen by a dog, especially when the dog in question appears to endorse one's romantic intentions by refusing to leave. "Lady Eleanor will say I attract disorder," Anne said. "She may be right." "And what do you say?" I looked at Pip, then at her. "I say that some forms of disorder improve an evening." Her expression softened then, not much, but enough. "You know, most men would be embarrassed by this. Most men have not had sufficient practice." That pleased her, I think. At least she did not mock it. Pip remained through the fish course, during which he behaved with the gravity of a diner who disapproves of excess speech and approves of soul. The waiters, seeing that he belonged decisively somewhere, ceased to object. One even brought him a saucer. Thus established, he became less an intrusion than a third party to the understanding. It was later, over coffee, that the evening took the turn I had hoped for, and yet hardly dared expect. The room had quieted. The rush had passed. Outside, I could see rain beginning in the lamplight, soft, slanting rain that made the street beyond the glass look suddenly private and far away. Anne turned her cup slowly in its saucer. "I am glad," she said, "that we are here like this. As am I. And not because of a missing groom or a dog on the loose or legal extortion. That improves it, certainly." She looked up. "But also because things are easier now." I knew what she meant. The absurdity of the week before, for all its danger, had stripped away some of the usual social fencing. She had seen me dusty, wrong, late, and determined. I had seen her tired, sharp, brave, and kinder than she let most people suppose. There is no great mystery after that. Or rather, what remains is of a more agreeable kind. "I have often thought," I said slowly, "that a man is at a disadvantage who spends too much time beside someone as brilliant as Poirot. One becomes accustomed to looking second best before one has properly begun." Anne considered this without haste. "Yes, I imagine that is true." I laughed a little. It sounds rather plaintive when put aloud. "No, only honest." She rested one hand lightly against the tablecloth. "For what it is worth, Captain Hastings, I do not think I should care very much for brilliance at dinner. It usually talks too much, and notices whether the cutlery agrees with itself. I prefer someone who can be counted on when everything has gone wrong. There are remarks which ought to be answered at once, and cannot be because they go rather deeper than conversation is prepared for." I found myself looking at her without for once any very polished reply in reserve. At last I said, "That is about the nicest thing anyone has said to me in some time." "Well," she replied, with that quick returning glint of humour, "I would not make a habit of it. It might affect your character." "I have been trying to improve that too." "Yes, so I gathered from the tie." Pip sighed and leaned against my ankle. The room was warm. The rain went on beyond the window. It came over me with a curious sense of stillness that I could have sat there another 3 hours and asked no more from the evening than to continue. Still, a man must risk something. "Anne, I should like very much to see you again." She did not pretend not to understand me. That was one of the things I liked best about her. I thought that was the point of tonight. It was. But I mean properly, repeatedly, without requiring a family crisis as pretext. That sounds ambitious. Moderately. And what would these future meetings involve? I considered. Dinner, I hope. Walks. The occasional theatre if the play is not idiotic. And perhaps the understanding that if a dog arrives, he is to be admitted without prejudice. She smiled. That last condition may be difficult to refuse. Pip has very fixed views. As, I begin to see, do I. For a second we only looked at one another. Then she said, "Yes. I think that may be arranged." No fireworks followed. No violins, no declarations, no theatrical interruption from heaven, and I am glad of it. Such things are for youth or opera. What passed instead was far better, an ease, a promise, the quiet certainty that one had stepped, not stumbled, not been driven, but stepped, into something one hoped would continue. We rose at last. Pip, who had slept through the greater part of my emotional future, awoke and shook himself with the complacency of a creature who feels a successful evening has been largely his work. Outside, the rain had dwindled to a fine silver drift. "I ought to send him back," Anne said, glancing down at the dog. "Do you suppose he will consent?" "No." "Then perhaps we had better walk him a little first." She took my arm as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Yes, but let us try, just for one evening, not to lose anyone." Pip trotted ahead of us, the lead swinging, his ears dancing with importance. And as we turned into the lamplit street, I reflected that for a man who had once imagined romance required moonlight, certainty, and a better class of preparation, there was a great deal to be said for laughter, rain, and a spaniel who refused to leave matters to chance. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of The Bridegroom Who Mislaid Himself. This was a case that wore a comic mask at first. Stag night foolishness, missed details, the sort of cheerful disorder that men insist is nothing at all. And then showed its real face. A neat plan built on leverage, timing, and the quiet power of making other people look guilty before they've even understood the game. If you enjoyed this kind of Hastings-led mystery, where the danger isn't only in dark corners, but in what can be suggested in polite company, tell us in the comments what you'd like next. Another London tangle of clubs and corridors, a country house complication with sharp manners, or a more exotic case where the stakes travel with the luggage. And if you'd like to support Nocturnal Tales, this episode was made possible thanks to our Patreon supporters and the listeners who send one-off donations on Buy Me a Coffee or PayPal. The links are in the description. For now, thank you again for staying with us to the last line. Until the next case, be wary of messages that cannot wait. Remember that the cleanest scandals are often the most deliberate, and never underestimate the investigative value of a small dog with strong opinions.